Okay, so I think we should start. Professor Kregel, on behalf of the class of students who's listening, the class of students listening to you on behalf of the Ideas program, we are very happy to have you today for this lecture. We understand there are three lectures. This is the first of the three. We look forward to the lectures. As I said, you will speak for an hour or so. We take a short break, and then we'll continue with your lecture. If among the audience, if there are any specific questions that you can't wait and you have to ask them, please raise your hands, and then we will interrupt Professor Kregel. Otherwise, he has promised to stop at some point, and then we will have a discussion. Okay. With these few words, I welcome you, Professor Kregel. On to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sim. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to speak in the Ideas program. And what I'm going to present to you today is really a very personal sort of reflection that I have made on the problems of development finance over the last, I won't say how many years, it goes back some years, in which I will be going back basically to my original training with John Robinson in Cambridge to try and put together a comprehensive idea of the way post-Keynesian theory deals with or has influenced the theory of economic development on the one hand, and in particular the problems of development finance. Now, I say development finance and economic theory relative to post-Keynesian economics because it is in general presumed that post-Keynesian theory was basically a theory of growth and distribution for developed economies, and that there was very little concern for the problems of economic development. This, in fact, was not true. Those of you who are familiar with Joan Robinson's work and her, shall we say, her life story, know that she took a very active interest in developing economies. She was a frequent visitor to Asia, particularly to India and China. And she was always concerned with the implications of what she liked to call neoclassical theory to the detriment of developing economies. Now, her published work, in fact, did not have a great deal on economic development. So that what I'm going to try to do is to start out today and talk about the basic theoretical monetary backgrounds to post-Keynesian theory. Tomorrow, to look in more particular items and the particular way in which Joan Robinson's theories have had a direct impact on the theory of economic development. And then in the third lecture, to go ahead and focus on the impact of international financial flows on development finance on the one hand, and the instability of developing economies on the other. In particular, trying to pick up the problems of the debt problem, which have been faced by developing countries for at least the last 100 years, and the problem which is becoming more acute as we go forward into the problems of responding to environmental and climate change. Okay. Now, the beginning section is going to appear rather simple. Okay. Now, I've made reference here to this idea of misplaced concreteness. Okay. Now, everybody knows that in Keynesian theory, we make a big deal about the fallacy of composition. Okay, the fallacy of composition is what? Well, in general, we use the argument of the fallacy of composition when we talk about the policies to change relative prices. The economy is not at full employment. Why? Well, it's not at full employment if you're a neoclassical economist because labor is too expensive. The relative prices of capital and labor are not appropriate. So what do? We try to change the relative prices. And usually we talk about increasing profitability and reducing wages. Well, if we increase profitability and reduce wages, we pull out what we call the fallacy of composition card and say, well, profits are determined by income, income is determined by wages, so that if you cut wages, you cut income, and you can't manage to improve the situation simply by cutting off one side without looking at the other. So that's our fallacy of composition problem. The misplaced concreteness problem comes basically from the way neoclassical theory argues in terms of formulating economic policy, right? And formulating economic policy in what sense? Well, misplaced concreteness is what? Basically, the misplaced concreteness refers to the fact that in formulating any sort of policy, we're going to have some sort of simplification. Simplification in what sense? In the sense of a theory, right? Now, we usually call them theories, but really they're stories. That is, they're stories about the way you think a simplified economy works. And you then deduce from that simplified economy the idea that something that will work in the simplified economy will work in the real economy. So that a policy that starts out with, and we'll give a simple example, John Robinson liked to criticize neoclassical growth theory because of its theory of capital. Well, there are all sorts of aspects of that theory of capital. And one of them is that if you look at the models that were put forward for neoclassical growth models, these are what we call one commodity models. That is, you have a single thing which is called capital, and you have a single thing which is called output. And she would argue always to say, well, it's very difficult to talk about a market process, to talk about price adjustments if you only have one commodity. Because if you only have one commodity, there's nothing to adjust. Nothing can change in that system. But the argument always was that if you have labor, and labor is something and capital is something, then if you adjust the price of labor to capital, you would go to full employment. That would be, or she would argue, that would be an example of misplaced concreteness. That is, you believe that the policies that would work in an economy in which capital is one homogeneous lump. She liked to talk about capital as being ghee. He said it's just like butter. It's something that you can mold up. It's a single thing. And then the output is the output that you produce between capital and labor. So misplaced concreteness would say, if you draw your conclusions from that sort of simplified economy, okay, that's misplaced concreteness, because that's not the way the real world works. And interestingly enough, in the capital theory debates, which we'll look at a little bit later, even Paul Samuelson recognized that neoclassical simplification of a one commodity world was one which did not produce results that could be generalized, that you could produce policy. Okay, so this is our problem of misplaced concreteness. That is, we're sort of stuck. John Robinson always liked to say that you have to abstract, you have to have a theory. Why? Well, her argument was the basic one that we all now know, is that if you're going to have a map to get from A to B, a map which has a representation of 1-to-1 doesn't help you. Okay, it has to have some sort of simplification. But when you do that, you end up with this problem of misplaced concreteness. You believe that the theoretical simplified economy is in fact the real world, and you fail to take into consideration those difficulties. An additional difficulty comes from Hirschman. Hirschman made a very interesting observation. He said one of the difficulties that economists have is that everybody is an economist. What did he mean? Well, he says everybody participates in the economy, which means that everybody knows how the economy works. Well, they know how the economy works. Why? Simply by their own personal observations. And it's very easy to take those personal observations and extend them to the general case. Now, that's as bad as misplaced concreteness, because what you're doing is saying that what is valid for me is valid for every other piece of the theory. Obviously, that's not true. But the difficulty is that it makes trouble for an economist who puts forward an argument that looks different from people's personal representations. Okay? Now, the last problem with this is what we call selection bias, and that's part of this Hirschman problem. The selection bias is what? Well, it's obvious that if we look at the economy and we look at the institutions of the economy, we have the presumption that the way it is now is the way it's always been. There's a very nice definition of a conservative economist. A conservative economist thinks that the institutions and the conditions we perceive today have always existed, and therefore any change in those conditions will obviously make things worse. A difficulty that comes from selection bias. So the point that we're going to try to deal with today is to look at, obviously, if in the end we want to talk about finance, we want to talk about financial flows, we're going to start out with money. And we're going to look at, well, we're going to talk about the theory. I would rather call it the story of money. What is it and where did it come from? Now, I've got some nice pictures here. Everybody knows what money is. That is, if you're using your selection bias. If you were working in the 19th century, gold. Obviously, gold is money. Okay, virtually any economist you can find that was writing from the 17th century onwards said that gold was what? Gold was money. And there was a very good story, and we'll look at that story in a minute, about why gold was the best money that you could actually have in the economy. Okay, even Adam Smith was of this opinion. You move on to the right side. Oh, there we have banknotes. Okay, banknotes. If you're writing in the 19th or 20th century, obviously, what is money? Money is a banknote. There's no more gold anymore. We've gotten rid of that. Keynes taught us that gold was a barbarous relic. So we now have banknotes. So if you're born today and somebody asks you what is money, you pull out a banknote. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about both of these observations is if we go back to the 18th and 19th century and gold, in fact, gold was hardly ever used in everyday transactions. The majority of transactions were done in terms of other types of metals, and in many cases with things that were not even precious metals. Okay? So that the presumption that gold was the ideal money didn't even apply in practice. Now, if we look today, in the case of banknotes, For most countries, the circulation of banknotes is the minimal part of the total money supply. The total money supply is supplied by what? Well, it's supplied by bank deposits. That is, these are liabilities of private institutions, not the banknotes that are supposedly issued by governments. So already, simply by looking at this idea of saying, we say selection bias, the idea that we think something, that something turns out, if we look underneath it, turns out not to be true. And the question is how we can look underneath those presumptions and to look at those simplifications that make it difficult to understand how the system works. Now, if we start out with a quick background summary, background notes on money and finance, and we look at post-Keynesian theory. Post-Keynesian theory came where? Well, I will again refer back to Joan Robinson. Joan Robinson in the early 1950s was working on what she called the generalization of the general theory. Okay? She was building on the general theory. She was a participant in the discussions that produced the general theory, along with Richard Kahn, James Mead, and a number of other economists. And her idea was that the general theory provided what we would say a revolution in economic theory, a completely new way of looking at traditional theory, an alternative to what she came to call the neoclassical theory. Now, that neoclassical theory is usually represented by the Cambridge or the post-Keynesian theories of growth and distribution. Now, the theories of growth and distribution were a generalization in the sense that you wanted to move beyond the determination of the output or employment equilibrium of the system and to look at the evolution, the development, the growth of that system over time. And we associate this with the name of also of Nicholas Kaldor, Michel Kalecki, and Luigi Passanetti, amongst other post-Keynesian economists. But for the Cambridge economists that initiated this theory, the idea was that it should be an alternative to traditional theory. It was an alternative to the marginal theory of distribution. That is, we could explain the distribution of income between wages and profits, not in terms of maximization at the margin, profit maximization, utility maximization, and so forth, but in terms of the theory of effective demand and the theory of effective demand over time. So that if you look at the way the system was thought to behave, instead of having a system of adjustment based on the micro idea of substitution, which Marshall had developed and taught to all of his pupils, the system adjusted not by changes in relative prices, but by changes in demand, as driven by relative incomes and by relative decisions to save out of those incomes. So you end up with an alternative methodology. An alternative methodology to what? Well, if you look at the traditional neoclassical theory, the neoclassical theory, interestingly enough, 1936, the same year in which the general theory was published, Paul Samuelson published his theory of economic policy, which was based on what he called the correspondence principle. Correspondence principle is what? Well, basically, the correspondence principle says that you can look at the determinations of an equilibrium, and you can use that equilibrium configuration to predict the adjustment, the dynamic adjustment of the system when the data of the system change. That is, that you can, if you like, take this idea of economic equilibrium at the margin, and you can use that in order to generate economic policy. This is an example of, well, we're going to argue this is an example of misplaced concreteness. Misplaced concreteness, why? Because this idea of individuals maximizing at the margin is not something that ever exists, in fact, in reality. Now, unfortunately, most of the criticism has been one to say, well, this is not realistic. Well, the problem is not that it's not realistic. As we said, you have to abstract. Theory always requires abstraction. The problem is that you use this correspondence principle to support this idea that you can generalize from the static equilibrium to the dynamic equilibrium. John Robinson always complained, argued about this incessantly with somebody who became a colleague of hers in Cambridge, with Frank Hahn. That is, it was only, she argued, possible to talk about comparative statics. Okay, you could talk about a particular position of equilibrium, and you could talk about another position of equilibrium. You could identify the differences, but you could not argue that one equilibrium would automatically develop into the other on the basis of that equilibrium configuration. Now, that particular problem, as I said, started out already in 1936. There's a very interesting book which has currently been published about why post-Keynesian economics or Keynesian economics died in Cambridge. And there's a very nice representation in that book about the debates between John Robinson and Frank Hahn over precisely this particular problem. Is neoclassical static equilibrium the basis for making economic policies, or do you need an alternative methodology? Now, this same problem comes up in another form of neoclassical economics, traditional economics, and that's what we call the classical dichotomy. The classical dichotomy is what? Well, we'll talk about that more in detail as we go along, but the classical dichotomy is the version of this correspondence principle that was eventually adopted by those people who developed the general theory in the 1950s. And it was basically the idea that there was a distinction between the real and the nominal, or the real variables in the economy and the monetary variables in the economy. And that in the long run, money variables had no impact on the real variables. That's the classical dichotomy. And this we see eventually in the early quantity theory of money, and you see it in Milton Friedman's reproposition of the quantity theory of money, this classical dichotomy. So we have to deal with that. We have to discover, why do we have that classical dichotomy? And I'm going to argue that that classical dichotomy is, again, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. There are other alternative versions of this, gross substitution theorems. The gross substitution theorem is what? Well, the gross substitution theorem simply says that relative prices will always exhaust any excess supplies in the system. Okay, gross substitution basically says that if the price of bananas goes down, there will be an increase in the demand for bananas, and this will be compensated by an increase in the price of computers. And people will decide to substitute bananas for computers. Now, I made that example a little silly, but basically that's the argument. The argument is that relative price adjustments will always be compensating in the system. Now, this is, again, a question of this fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Because if you do it for two commodities, yes, it probably works. If you do it for n commodities, not so much. And if you do it between bananas and computers, probably not at all. Finally, there's this idea of general equilibrium, the famous Arrow de Brujan general equilibrium that produces an argument which says that prices can produce a general equilibrium in the sense of full utilization of all resources, that is full employment. But what? But as Frank Hahn very candidly admits, that there is no place for money in the theory of general equilibrium. It simply can't be done. Well, this is not a question of misplaced concreteness. This is simply a theory which argues that it deals with the real world by presuming that the real world doesn't exist. Different version. Now, if we go back and look at money in Keynesian theory and post-Keynesian theory, we need to go back to the treatise on money. Okay, John Robinson wrote a very nice article that was published shortly after Keynes wrote his treatise. And in that article, she's made the interesting observation. She said, well, what Keynes did was he wrote a book on the theory of money, but he failed to realize that, in fact, what he had done was to transform the theory of money into a theory of output adjustment, a theory of employment adjustment. That is, that he had gone from a theory of monetary equilibrium to an explanation of the determination of the level of employment. And how did he do that? Well, she says quite clearly what he did was by focusing on, now I'm going to surprise everybody, not on effective demand, because effective demand doesn't exist yet in the treatise, on the theory of prices. That is, he substituted the quantity theory of prices, MV is equal to PT or whatever, however you want to write it, with an alternative explanation of prices. And these are his fundamental equations, the fundamental equations of consumption goods prices and investment goods prices, in the sense that prices are determined by wage costs, efficiency wages, plus the difference between savings and investment. So the basis prices are determined by the amount that workers earn and spend, and prices will then increase or decrease from that level depending on whether or not entrepreneurs are spending more in building investment goods, in building capital goods, than they're saving for those capital goods, and vice versa. So she puts this as this confrontation between two different theories of price, two different theories of money, and two different theories of determining the level of output. So if we look at the quantity theory is just change in the money supply, changes the price level, but here comes the classical dichotomy. The classical dichotomy says what? Classical dichotomy says it doesn't make any difference that those prices change. The level of real output and employment will stay the same. It will stay the same either because of the long-run neutrality of money, or because of the gross substitution theorem, or because of the correspondence principle. But, she said, Keynes in the treatise rejected all of that. If investment exceeds savings, then prices are going to increase. If wages go up at a faster rate than the level of employment, then prices are going to go up. And it's the decisions to increase investment and the decisions to increase wages that are the determinants of prices. That is, if you like, that's the demand side. So this is what we're looking at in terms of the confrontation, and this is why it's important to identify, as we've argued, why it's important to identify either the correspondence principle or the classical dichotomy or the gross substitution theorem. This is where we have that problem, because that's what allows the quantity theory to make the statement that the system is always at full employment, that you don't need a theory of output. Now, Keynes tells us himself that in the general theory, what he was trying to do was to get out from what he believed was the dominance of the quantity theory. Okay? And basically, it's interesting. We look, these are quotations that come from the preface to the general theory and the preface to the French edition. They sound very much like this article that John Robinson wrote after the treatise. Okay. Beginning of the preface to the general theory, the composition of this book has been for the author a long struggle of escape. And so must the reading of it be for most readers. And it's difficult. Why? It's difficult because, as he said, everybody has been brought up with habitual modes of thought and expression. Those habitual thoughts of mode and expression, well, that's the selection bias. That's the belief that the quantity theory makes sense. Makes sense why? Well, it's quite obvious. If you have more money, you spend more, and if you spend more, prices go up. And Keynes is saying, no, that's not the way the system works. Okay? We look at the preface to the French edition. I've called this book The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. The third feature to which I may call attention is the treatment of money and prices. It's a theory of prices. The following analysis registers my final escape from the confusion of the quantity theory, which once entangled me. I regard the price level as a whole as being determined in precisely the same way as individual prices. That is to say, under the influence of supply and demand. So he's saying what we're going to do is we're going to look at the existing theory, and we're going to say, yes, supply and demand is fine. The problem is that we have failed to identify those factors which determine the movements of supply and demand. And then he goes on to say, prices, both individual prices and the price level, emerge as the resultant of these two factors. Money and the quantity of money are not direct influence at this stage of the proceedings. They have done their work at an earlier stage of the analysis. Okay, and then he goes on, the quantity of money determines the supply of liquid resources, that is finance, and hence the rate of interest. Conjunction with other factors, the decisions to invest, which determines the level of output and employment. So we find that the general theory is what? Well, the general theory, Keynes says, is the theory of a monetary economy. A monetary economy is what? A monetary economy is one in which the correspondence principle does not hold. When I began to write my treatise on money, I was moving on traditional lines. I thought money was something separate from the general theory of supply and demand. And he said, when I finished, I had made some progress toward pushing monetary theory back to becoming a theory of output as a whole. But my lack of emancipation from preconceived ideas showed itself in what now seems to me to be the outstanding fault of the theoretical parts of that work, that I failed to deal thoroughly with the effects of changes in the level of output. Okay, now what I did was to look at an instantaneous picture of a given output and how, given that output, forces could develop which involved a profit disequilibrium. Profit disequilibrium is the divergence between savings and investment. The dynamic development, as distinct from the instantaneous picture, was left incomplete. And that's what the general theory is trying to explain, that adjustment process. Okay? Now, while it is found that money enters into the economic scheme in an essential and peculiar manner, technical monetary detail falls into the background. Okay? That technical monetary detail is what? That technical monetary detail is what Keynes put forward in his treatise on money. He then goes on to define a monetary economy by two factors. One, changing views about the future are capable of influencing the quantity of employment and not merely its direction. Two, it is linked up with our fundamental theory of value that gives us a more general theory which includes the classical theory with which we are familiar as a special case. Okay, so the problem that we've got to look at is how do we bring that technical monetary detail back into the analysis that we've looked at. Now, we've already talked about this correspondence principle, okay? If we look at this correspondence principle, Samuelson himself notes the relevance of this application to the analysis of the demand for money. Quotation from Samuelson: "The most interesting problems arising in connection with money are linked up with the fact of uncertainty in the most general sense, leading into liquidity considerations which cannot be discussed here." Well, basically what Samuelson has just said is that we've got a theory now without changing views about the future. And if that's the case, there can't be any monetary economy. So we have, again, this confrontation. There is no discussion of the impact of money on the quantity of output or employment. And as a result, there's no alternative theory of supply and demand. Okay? So Samuelson 36 recognizes the same thing that Keynes is saying in 1936. And these are two, we said, diametrically opposed views of the way money and finance enter into the system. Now, that classical dichotomy comes from where? Well, we can look at, and I balanced here this classical dichotomy along with gross substitution, because they're both more or less the same thing. The classical quantity theory, which we'll call solving the barter problem. Okay? Smith talks about money as the great wheel of commerce. We'll look at some quotations from Smith in a minute. But it's basically the thing which allows the division of labor. Okay? When we analyze or provide the theory, remember we started out with that question, what is money and where does it come from? Okay? It comes from what Smith created in terms of what we call the division of labor problem. Okay, the division of labor is what? Well, if we read Smith, we know that the wealth of nations is determined by rate of growth of population and the rate of growth of productivity. The rate of growth of productivity comes from where? Well, Smith told us a story about the pin factory. Okay, now many people like to think that the pin factory argument is an argument about what? Technical progress, innovation. Well, it is and it isn't. Okay? Smith talks about the pin factory, but the technical aspect of the production of pins, which he borrows from a French encyclopedia, the technical aspects of the production of pins, okay, is not changing. That is, there's no technological revolution in the production of pins. What changes? What changes is specialization in the production of pins. That is, instead of one person undertaking all the stages of production in the production of pins, you now break it up. Okay? It's the organization of a technique of production. Okay? The technical aspects of pin production stay the same. The technology stays the same. Nothing changes. There's no Schumpeter, if you like, in this argument. What is in the argument, however, is a difference between, and we'll put it now in a different way, between economic self-sufficiency and economic specialization. And what is the story that Smith tells and many other people tell? Well, the story is this. Robinson Crusoe. Remember Robinson Crusoe? Robinson Crusoe got stuck on a desert island. And he had to do everything on his own. He had to do, if he was deciding to make pins, to make every stage in the pin making process on his own. Now, in order to increase the output of pins, what does he argue? Well, you say that instead of doing everything yourself, you specialize. And what do you need to specialize? Well, fortunately, he found his man Friday, which allowed him to specialize. But he could have specialized without Friday. That is, he could have done one stage of pin production on Monday, another stage on Tuesday, another stage on Wednesday, and so forth. Okay? Now, the difficulty here is what? The problem to be solved is what? Well, if you specialize, and now you get to the basic story of the neoclassical argument, that is, say, for example, you're producing boots. You specialize in boot production. If you specialize in boot production, you can't eat boots. How are you going to survive? The only way you can survive is if you can find a baker. If you can find a baker who specializes in baking bread, the boot producer can exchange boots for bread. The bread producer, well, the bread producer also has a problem. You can't bake bread without farmer. So you go to find the miller. The miller buys grain from the farmer, and now the miller and the farmer have to exchange in order to allow bread, in order for that bread to allow the bootmaker to survive. Okay, so economic survival depends on what? Well, economic survival depends on the ability, and this is Smith's argument about individuals higgling and bargaining in exchange, bartering back and forth, okay, in order to survive. Okay, so the idea of the division of labor directly leads us to a story. And that story is what? That story is the barter relations, the exchange relations between different specialized producers. Now, the argument that Smith makes, the solution that Smith gives is what? Well, obviously, what you have to do, number one, is to have a market. And that market is what? The market is the place in which prices are determined. And those prices are determined how? Well, they're determined in the rates of exchange between all the specialized producers. Okay, now we've solved the problem. Smith was very happy. Smith argued that the market was going to allow the wealth of nations, and it was going to be prices which allowed the market to do that. But what kind of prices did we have? Well, if we're talking about one-on-one barter exchange, those barter exchanges are what? Well, those are what we call real exchange ratios. It's the amount of oranges that you exchange for a banana. Right? Now, if you think about this problem, and the neoclassical economists thought very hard about the problem, they came up with a number of difficulties. The first difficulty was that if everybody has to exchange one-on-one with some other specialized producers, you're going to end up with what? Well, you're going to end up with a very large number of real rates of exchange if, in fact, everybody has to go out and bargain with everybody else. We have a very nice formula that explains this. And that formula says that it's probably implausible to think that, in fact, specialization, division of labor, occurred simply because people were going out and exchanging, were bartering their outputs relative to the other outputs. Now, if you think about the determination of these real exchange rates, this is what Marshall called the pure theory of domestic values. That is, these are real rates of return. These are bananas for oranges, going back and forth. Now, you start thinking about this problem, okay? Think about it yourself, okay? And very quickly you come up with a difficulty, okay? You go with your cow, you take your cow to the market and you want to buy some beans. Well, what happens if there is nobody who wants a cow? System breaks down. What happens if there are people who want to buy a cow, but they don't want to buy a whole cow? They just want to buy some steak with their beans. Again, the process breaks down. It breaks down because, and here we get with the famous argument of what? The famous argument about the double coincidence of wants. Double coincidence of wants says what? Well, double coincidence of wants that says in order for this story that we have now about exchange determining real relative prices depends on there always being somebody who is willing to exchange what you have for what you want and to exchange in the amounts of what you have and what you want. Okay? Now, if we've gotten to this point, you say, well, obviously, okay, here comes our friend selection bias comes in. Well, if we look around, I see that people use money for exchange. Obviously, somehow or other, this problem that we've created, the story that we've created about the difficulty of producing barter exchange in the market and producing equilibrium prices got solved in the market. How did it get solved? Well, obviously it got solved because people decided that they could specify all of these commodities in terms of one single commodity. And that single commodity would reduce the number of real exchange ratios from this very large number to n minus 1, where n is the number of commodities, and that one commodity that we're taking out of there is what? Is the commodity which we're going to use as money. It's going to be the unit of account. Okay? Now, perfect solution to the problem. Okay? But did the problem ever exist? Obviously not. There is no historical evidence that any system developed on the basis of pure barter exchange. So what we've done is we've committed the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. That is, we believed that that barter story was something that actually happened, and we've now proposed a solution to that problem, which is to pick one commodity, and that one commodity is going to be called money. Now, at this stage, what do? We say, well, it's obvious that the thing which is going to satisfy money probably can't be a cow. It's probably going to be something that holds its value over time, something that can be divisible, blah, 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 blah. We all know the story, and that story is what? Well, gold is the best commodity that can solve the problem that we've created in our story. But it's a problem that doesn't exist. It never existed. Now, once we've gotten to this point, what happens? Well, if the money that we have is a commodity, okay, if it's a commodity in the system, and suddenly the amount of that commodity increases, let's say the amount of that commodity doubles, okay, because all we're doing is comparing all of the other commodities relative to that commodity as a standard. What happens? Well, the amount of gold goes up, it doubles. Because the amount of gold doubles, what happens? What happens is that you now pay twice as much gold for a physical commodity, and you pay twice as much gold for every other physical commodity that you want, which means that all of those other physical commodities relative to each other don't change. They don't adjust. Their real rates of return stay exactly the same when you double the amount of the commodity that you're using as the money commodity. And here we are at the solution or the proposed idea that money is neutral. That is, in the long run, money has no impact on the real economy. Why? Because it's simply a unit of account that doesn't change the real relations between apples and bananas. Price of apples doubles, the price of bananas doubles, but the rate of exchange between apples and bananas or apples and oranges, or apples and anything else does not change. Okay? Now, that's where the quantity of theory comes from. And that's where the theory that what? That the level of output is independent of monetary factors comes from. Okay? And this is the theory that Keynes was arguing against. This is what he was trying to replace. Why? Because what did that theory argue? That theory argued that the system would always move to full utilization of output, would always move to full employment. And Keynes' argument was, well, this is 1936, okay? Unemployment is, well, in 1933, if you look at the US figures, unemployment was something like 1/4 of the labor force. So clearly there was something wrong with the theory. But if we look at the theory, there was nothing wrong with it. It was perfectly coherent. It was perfectly consistent. If what? If you believe in the correspondence principle and if you believe in the classical dichotomy. Okay, and this is why Keynes talks about his long struggle to escape. How do you get out of that kind of argument? Okay, think of the argument again. We have an economy, we have all of these goods that exchange with each other relative to gold. If the amount of gold increases, the rates of exchange between gold and all of the other commodities increase, but there's nothing that causes the rates of exchange between those other commodities to change. You can tell a dynamic story. The dynamic story is what? Well, you simply look at the Spanish invasion of South America. The increase in the quantity of gold led to what? A massive increase in prices. So obviously, this theory was right. The dynamic theory is what? Well, the dynamic theory that eventually comes from Milton Friedman, it comes from Milton Friedman or it comes from Alfred Marshall. It says that if you have more money, Friedman talks about money burning a hole in your pocket. What do? If you've got too much money, you go out and spend it. And if you go out and spend it, you drive up prices. But simply because you're spending more doesn't mean you're going to spend more on apples than you spend on bananas. You're simply spending more. And if you're spending more on both apples and bananas. And apples and bananas are going to increase in price, but their relative prices are not going to change. Again, money is a veil. Money is something that allows division of labor to take place. It allows the market to function, but it has no impact on the real decisions, the real rates of return. The corollary of this was Stuart Mill, who produced a theory which talks about general gluts. Okay, so he said, okay, yeah, it's possible that every once in a while you end up with too much of this, but if you've got too much of this, then you have too little of that. Okay, here we're back to gross substitution. Yes, general gluts are possible, but this will eventually be eliminated by what? Eliminated by those adjustments in relative prices. Okay, the correspondence principle will talk about that adjustment. So it might be the case, okay, in the short run, money may mess up the market a little bit, but eventually the system will always go back to equilibrium. General gluts are possible, but. So when Keynes talks about his theory being one that changes the level of output, okay, he says it will change both the direction and the level, quantities of output. So there we have sort of, in a nutshell, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about this idea of misplaced concreteness. Where did that argument come from, which said that the system will always be at full employment? Well, step back, step back, step back. Where did we start? We started with, division of labor. We told a story about specialization. We told the story about Robinson Crusoe. We said that to solve the Robinson Crusoe problem, to solve the division of labor problem, we had to create what? You had to create money, and the money you created turned out to be neutral. It turned out to have no impact on the system. Okay, so this is why we're arguing it's important to look at this fallacy of misplaced concreteness. There we are. So now, what we're going to go on to argue now is that that story is not only historically wrong, is not only philosophically wrong, that is wrong because of the misplaced concreteness argument, but we're going to argue that, in fact, most economists who looked at this problem, okay, told a different story. That is, this is not the story that they told. They talked about an alternative. Okay, now let's go back all the way. We go back to Plato. Okay, you probably didn't expect me to be talking about Plato. But, you know, once we started with these fallacies of composition and misplaced concreteness, obviously we needed some of these philosophy people to help us out. Okay, let's look at Plato in the Republic. Okay. In fact, he looks very much like Adam Smith stole everything from Plato. He talks about exchange with one another. One gives, another receives. Suppose that one man is a husbandman, another a builder, someone else a weaver. Shall we want to add them a shoemaker, or perhaps some other purveyor to our bodily wants? How will they proceed? Will each bring the result of his labors into a common stock? The individual husbandman, for example, producing for 4 and laboring 4 times as long and as much as he needs in the provision of food with which he supplies others as well as himself? Or will he have nothing to do with others, but provide for himself alone 1/4 of the food in 1/4 of the time, and in the remaining 3/4 of his time be employed in making a house or a coat or a pair of shoes, having no partnership with others? Producing food only and not at producing everything would be the better way. We are not all alike. There are diversities of nature among us, which are adapted to different occupations. And will you have a work better done when the workman has many occupations than when he has only one? And if so, we must infer that all things are produced more plentifully and easily and of better quality when one man does one thing which is natural to him and does it at the right time and leaves other things. Okay? Sounds very much like Smith here, doesn't it? Oops. Aristotle talks about the natural and unnatural methods of acquiring goods. Okay. Basically, he talks about mutual need of the different goods made it essential to contribute one's share, and it is on this basis that many of the non-Greek people still proceed, i.e. by exchange, one class of useful goods for another. For example, they take and give wine for corn and so on. Such a technique of exchange is not contrary to nature and is not a form of money-making, for it keeps to its original purpose, to reestablish nature's own equilibrium of self-sufficiency. As soon as the import of necessities and the export of surplus goods began to facilitate the satisfaction of needs beyond national frontiers, men inevitably resorted to the use of coined money. For purposes of exchange, men entered into an agreement to give to each other and accept from each other some commodity itself useful for business of living and also easily handled, such as iron, silver, and the like. And what started as a necessary exchange became more systematic as men became more experienced. Currency was intended to be a means of exchange, whereas interest represents an increase in the currency itself. Hence its name, for each animal produces its like, and interest is currency born of currency. What he says is that as long as we're exchanging to get what we need for our self-sufficiency, that's fine. But in general, what's going to happen is that individuals are going to be buying and selling goods in order to do what? In order to make a profit. Okay? The technique of acquiring goods concerned primarily with coin Coin is the unit of measurement by which it is performed, and there is indeed no limit to the amount of riches to be got from this mode of acquiring goods. What he's arguing is that basically money arose. Why? Because you had middlemen who were willing to buy and sell excess commodities and to make a profit by doing this. Okay? Plato now comes back and he says, what is the solution to this problem? Well, the solution to this problem of exchange is then there must be another class of citizens who will bring the required supply from another city. Therefore, what they produce at home must not only be enough for themselves, but such quantity and quality as to accommodate those from whom these wants are supplied. The more husbandmen and more artisans will be required, not to mention the importers and exporters, who are called merchants. And if merchandise is to be carried over the sea, skillful savers will also be needed. To secure such an exchange, they will need a marketplace and a money token for purposes of exchange. Okay? This want then creates a class of retail traders in our state. Is not retailer the term which is applied to those who sit in the marketplace, engaged in buying and selling, while those who wander from one city to another are called merchants? Between Plato and Aristotle, we're solving this problem of exchange. How? By creating another activity, by creating another class of individuals, these merchants or retailers. Now, the retailers are the ones who are doing what? Well, these are the ones who are solving the problem of the double coincidence of wants. If you can't find somebody to trade, what's going to happen? The merchant is going to come in and says, okay, I'll buy your cow. And I'll hold your cow until I find somebody who wants to buy a cow. And what am I going to do? I'm going to make money by doing that. Okay, so driving profit. And Aristotle was not too keen about this because he thought it was not so good. Okay, now if you go back to the rest of the argument is what? The rest of the argument is that basically what we're talking about in this problem of exchange is, number one, we need a unit of account. We need it of a unit of account in order to compare all of these goods. And number two, we need some intermediary, somebody to solve this problem of the double coincidence of wants. Now, Smith argues exactly the same thing. Let's skip over that. And finally, now get to Menger. Menger is supposed to be, the basic source of the neoclassical Austrian theory of money. Menger provides an explanation and the solution, and that is, had there not been a remedy in the very nature of things, to wit, the different degrees of salableness of commodities, the difference existing in this respect between articles of commerce is the highest degree of significance for the theory of money and of the market in general. Okay? The theory of money necessarily presupposes a theory of the salableness of goods. What does he mean by salableness? Well, he's saying that the money commodity is going to be what? Is going to be the thing that these merchants or retailers that Plato told us about are most willing to hold. Why? Because they can resell them. Okay? There is a process of intermediation of buyers and sellers moving in the market in order to provide that solution. Now, in order to do this, is it necessary to talk about money, or is it necessary to talk about the intermediaries? Who is solving the problem of the double coincidence of wants? It is the choice of gold as money, or is it, as Plato tells us, a natural profit-making activity which is carried out by individuals? Okay, if we go to Mises, Mises criticizes Menger, but basically what does he do? He says, well, what we're talking about is something that doesn't necessarily require any exchange. Robinson Crusoe faced the same problem. Okay. Robinson Crusoe said what? Well, here is Menger's position, criticizing Menger's theory of the origin of money. The historical question concerning the origin of indirect exchange and money is, after all, of no concern to praxeology. The only relevant thing is that indirect exchange and money exist because the conditions for the existence were and are present. Okay, what does that mean? Double coincidence of once. History may tell us where and when for the first time medium of exchange came into use and how. Subsequently, the range of goods employed for this purpose was more and more restrictive. As the differentiation between the broader notions of a medium of exchange and the narrow notion of money is not sharp, no agreement can be reached about the historical transition from simple media of exchange to money. Okay, he's saying, well, I really don't care that there's no historical evidence that this story that we tell about money can't be found. It is necessary to comprehend that one does not contribute anything to the scientific conception of human actions and social phenomena if one declares that the state or a charismatic leader or an inspiration which descended upon all the people have created them. Neither do such statements refute the teaching of a theory showing how such phenomena can be acknowledged as the unintentional outcome, the resultant not deliberately designed and aimed at by specifically individual endeavors of the members of society. So what does the neoclassical theory now tell us? It says that the classical dichotomy is something that comes from a story which never happened. We don't care that it never happened. We can't prove that historically it happened, but all we know is that because money exists, remember, selective bias, it's the unintentional outcome, the resultant not deliberately designed and aimed at by specifically individual endeavors of the members of society. Which means that, number one, this is something that was in the nature. If you like, you can go back to the idea of Smith and the idea of individuals representing this idea of truck, barter, and exchange. Okay? Now, the final point on this neoclassical approach, Menger suggests that we can only come fully to understand the origin of money by learning to view the establishment of the social procedure with which we are dealing as the spontaneous outcome, the unpremeditated resultant of particular individual efforts of the members of society who have little by little worked their way to a discrimination of different degrees of salableness in commodities. Okay? All we have to do is to allow individuals the freedom to transact in the market, and money naturally will evolve. Okay, this is, I think, the good point to take a break, because we now are in a position, or we have a position, to criticize those existing theories and to know the theory that Keynes was arguing against and to look at the alternative that he proposed. Okay, where's just him? There we go. Okay, we're now, okay, we can take the break.
Yeah,
And you
Professor
when
Kregel,
you're
let's
ready.
take a 10-minute break and then
Okay.
we'll come back. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you so much.
Recording in progress.
Professor Kregel, we can start. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, good. All right. Now, what we're going to do is to say that this entire neoclassical monetary construction, okay, is basically the barrier that Keynes had in trying to develop his alternative. And in fact, the alternative, what we're going to argue, was not only the alternative in terms of the explanation of prices, that is the substitution for the quantity theory, but in terms of a completely diverse explanation of the existence of money and basically how money has an impact on the economy. Now, this is important. Why? Well, it's important, as we've already said, that number one, it is still believed that the classical dichotomy more or less holds. That is, the best of the general equilibrium theory has no place for money. And it is often argued that Keynes' theory is a theory in real terms. And the basic point that Friedman made when he challenged Keynes' theory in terms of the monetarist counter-revolution was that Keynesian theory had no theory of money and no theory of prices, which we shall see is clearly false. We've already seen from the preface that we've read, the preface argued that the whole point of his theory was to provide an alternative approach to supply and demand in which the determination of prices was taken in what he defined as a monetary economy. Now, the argument is that Keynes developed this theory in the general theory. The response to that is no. That is, Keynes did substantial work on what he called ancient monies in the 1920s. And the theory that he develops in the general theory, that is technical monetary theory, had already started in his work in the 1920s. Now, in that work, okay, he talks about the most important thing for the social and economic purposes. What matters is the money of account, for it is the money of account which is the subject of contract and of customary obligation. Now, money of account is what? Well, if you think of money of account is something which we use to create a metric or a dimension. Okay, a metric or a dimension, measures of weight, okay, measures of distance. Monies of account are what? Monies of account are things which allow us to do things like comparisons or ranking. Okay, and Keynes already in this theory of the 1920s argues against the existence of metallic commodity money or coins as being necessary for that unit of account function. The presumption of many writers that where there were no coins, there was barter is far from accordance with the truth. So Keynes is arguing against, in this work in the 1920s, first of all, barter probably did not exist. Number two, coins were not the solution to the problem of exchange, and that solution was determined primarily by money of account. Okay? Now, if we look at chapter 1, sentence 1 of the treatise says what? Money of account, namely that in which debts and prices in general purchasing power are expressed, is the primary concept of a theory of money. Okay? It's not a single commodity. It's not solving the n-1 problem. It's the question of providing a unit, a money of account, which can be used for denominating debts, in which contracts for deferred payment and price lists, which are offers of contract for sale and purchase. Such debts and price lists, whether they are accorded by word of mouth or by book entry on baked bricks or paper documents, can only be expressed in terms of money of account. So perhaps we may elucidate the distinction between what he's going to call money and money of account by saying that the money of account is the description or the title and money is the thing which answers to the description. Now, if the same thing always answered to the same description, the distinction would have no practical interest. So basically, he's saying that you can denominate contracts in terms of any abstract unit. Okay, it could be weight, it could be distance, could be color, could be anything. It doesn't have to have a physical existence. The point is that if you write a contract, the contract has to be discharged. And the contract is going to be discharged in terms of what? It's going to be discharged in what he calls money or money proper. Because if money of account is an abstract unit, obviously you can't pay abstract units. Okay? So this is the beginning of the theory. Now, he then takes the distinction between money proper and bank money. Okay, bank money is what? Bank money is simply an acknowledgement of a private debt expressed in the money of account, which is used by passing from one hand to another, alternatively with money proper to settle a transaction. Okay, this is bank money. Why? Because this is the way the bankers operate. That is, if you go to a bank and you make a payment, what does the banker do? He debits your account and he credits somebody else's account. Okay, so that is bank money. Right? Now, what he says is that basically you could have bank money becoming the money of account, which would mean you would have a system of exchange, okay, in which there is no physical commodity that serves as money. Okay. Introduction of a money of account gives rise to two derived categories: offers of contract, contracts, and acknowledgments of debts, which are in terms of it, and money proper answering to it, delivery of which will discharge the contract or the debt. The first of these prepares the way for the next development, namely the discovery for that many purposes the acknowledgments of debt are themselves a serviceable substitute for money proper in the settlement of transactions. Okay, all you need is what? All you need is a system of accounts. All you need are bankers or bookkeepers, and you need a unit of account. And you can solve the problem of exchange without any reference to the problems of double coincidence of wants, or without any reference to the existence of a physical money. Now, this is not something that Keynes invented himself. William Petty: money is an artificial thing, or rather no thing, but is rather the sign of a thing. For if men were excellently versed in accounts, money were not necessary at all, and many places, as Barbados, etc., have made shift without it, and so they do in banks. James Stewart distinguishes between metal coin and money, which I call of account, is no more than an arbitrary scale of equal parts invented for measuring the respective value of things vendible. For the operation of bank transfers, those which only transfer the credit written down in their books from one person to another, I call banks of deposit. Adam Smith: buying and selling upon credit, and the different dealers compensating their credits with one another will supply physical money with less inconveniency than barter. Ricardo: instead of gold being used in exchange, money is merely written off one account and added to another. Payments effected without the intervention of either banknotes or money. Luigi Einaudi, in the 1930s, wrote a very famous paper dealing with European monetary systems in the 17th and 18th century. He talked about imaginary money. His imaginary was what? The imaginary money was the unit of account. And he argued that in Europe, almost all transactions in those periods were not made by paying gold coins, but they were denominated in terms of units of account, which did not correspond to any existing coins. And this is why he called it imaginary money. And this is what led Schumpeter to argue that it may be more useful to look upon capitalist finance as a clearing system that cancels claims and debt and carries forward the differences, so that money payments come in only as a special case without any particularly fundamental importance. A credit theory of money is possibly preferable to a monetary theory of credit. Again, Schumpeter in his treatise on money and history of economic analysis. But logically, it is by no means clear that the most useful method is to start from the coin. Even if making a concession to realism, we add inconvertible government paper in order to proceed to the credit transactions of reality. It may be more useful to start from them in that first place, to look upon capitalist finance as a clearing system that cancels claims and debt and carries forward the differences, so that money payments come in only as a special case without any fundamental importance. It is more realistic to say that the banks create credit, that is, that they create deposits in their act of lending, than to say that they lend the deposits that have been entrusted to them. In this method of obtaining a basically random unit of account as well as of entitlement lies, as we shall see, the core of the institution of money of the profit economy. Mitchell-Innes, banks are the clearinghouse of commerce. Colwell argues in his Ways and Means of Payment, banking is defined as a system by which men apply their credits to extinguishing of their debts, which is precisely what Keynes was arguing. This is in direct contrast with the cash or money system in which every article is either paid for in the precious metals at the time of delivery or at some time afterwards. These two systems work side by side. Now, what this does is to say that there are many ways in which you can solve Adam Smith's division of labor problem besides direct person-to-person barter exchange or through the operation of the market. We've already seen Plato, merchant traders, middlemen, intermediaries. Okay? If you look at any developed market for retail consumption goods, the retail buys from whom? He buys from the wholesaler. The wholesaler buys from whom? He buys from the producer. So that every type of exchange that exists in the system is intermediated, okay, by somebody who buys and sells. Okay, the producer buys inputs and sells outputs to the wholesaler. The wholesaler buys the output of the producer and sells it to the retailer. Okay, the retailer buys from the wholesaler and sells it to the final consumers. Okay, this is one way of solving the problem of exchange. Another way, centralized auction markets with an auctioneer. Okay, this is basically what Walras does in his market of tâtonnement. Interestingly enough, note that this is not even a market. Here, people don't exchange with each other. They simply exchange with an auctioneer. And the auctioneer is simply matching debits and credits. But there's no market. There's no higgling and bargaining in the market between two individuals. Everything takes place in terms of the matching of supply and demand orders. Clearinghouses. Clearinghouses were the basic mechanism by which bankers settled their debits and credits with each other. These were formal institutions. These are not market institutions. Okay? These are formal mechanisms by which balance sheets are matched against balance sheets of other individuals. Now, you could always have a social market coordinator with private ownership. The work of Lange and Abel-Lerner suggests that it's possible to have price adjustments in a market without having private ownership of the means of production or having individuals necessarily engaged in private possession. Socialist central planning of quantities, production and system of centralized buffer stocks. But a system of buffer stocks is the same thing as having a wholesaler in the market. Banks. Banks do what? Well, as we've already seen, Keynes talks about bank money. What do bankers do? They match debits and credits, okay? They allow exchange to take place. For every exchange, for every representation of supply and demand, the supplier, okay, who is selling something gets a credit. The buyer, okay, who is buying something gets a debit. Those debits and credits are all recorded in the banker's books. And what does the banker do? He simply matches off debits and credits across individual traders. Colwell. Bankers are bookkeepers. A class of men is formed to make it their business to deal in securities or evidence of debt. If a banker or broker purchases the two notes given by the merchant and his customer, it is obvious that both receive the means from him to pay the notes, of which he becomes the holder and the owner. He's simply doing what? He's simply matching debits and credits. Hawtrey, currency and credit. A dealer in, this is Hawtrey, a dealer in debts or credits is a banker. Hartley Withers. Most of the money that is stored in the community in the banks consists of bookkeeping credits lent to it by its bankers. It is usually supposed that bankers take money from one set of customers and lend it to other customers. But in most cases, the money taken by one bank has been lent by itself or another bank, and that the greater part of the bank's deposit consists not of cash paid in, but of credits borrowed. For every loan makes a deposit. Okay, now we're back to this problem. Now, this is problem of selection bias. Selection bias, if you believe money is a banknote, if you believe it's a piece of gold, this looks very strange. But what you're saying is actually the way the system functions is in terms of individuals dealing in debits and credits. And there are all sorts of ways in which the system can do this. I simply stick this in because the Broadway play about Alexander Hamilton has become very popular in the United States. If you look here at Alexander Hamilton, he absolutely knew this. Every loan which a bank makes is in its first shape a credit given to the borrower on its books, the amount of which it stands ready to pay either in its own notes or in gold or silver. Okay, so Keynes. In the treatise, a bank may create a claim against itself in favor of a borrower in exchange for his promise of subsequent reimbursement. Dennis Robertson, same argument. Schumpeter now talks about what? The E4 of capitalism. The E4 of capitalism, the banker is the E4 of capitalism. Why? Because the banker controls the books. For Schumpeter, the role of the unit of account is to permit the operation of an account settlement system under the individual decision-making characteristic of capitalism, and in contrast to the central planning of a socialist system. The result is a conflation of the role of the unit of account in making bookkeeping settlements with physical currency as a means of settling transactions. The blending of the physical and imaginary, something that has caused immense confusion to both laymen and monetary experts. Okay, we can go even, I mean, I can even give you quotations from Albert Hahn and even Hayek, who understood that money is not a physical unit. Mises understood the use of money is avoided because claims to money are transferred. Okay, Mitchell and Innes, Minsky, okay, nothing new here, okay. Everybody, okay? Such is the fundamental theory, but in practice, it is not necessary for a debtor to acquire credits on the same person to whom he is debtor. We are both buyers and sellers, so we are all in the same time both debtors and creditors of each other. And by the wonderfully efficient machinery of the banks to which we sell our credits, and which thus become the clearinghouses of commerce, the debts and credits of the whole community are centralized and set off against each other. In practice, therefore, any good credit will pay a debt. Okay? Now, basically, what this says is that if we look at the financial system is what? The financial system is composed not of N commodities and M traders. And the problem is not to engage in the determination of the exchange between those M commodities across the N traders, and it is not solved by the N-1 problem of allowing one commodity to resolve the problem of the double coincidence of wants. And it is not the case that money is independent of the real system. In Keynes's alternative, and in the alternative which was commonly adopted by virtually every monetary economist throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, money is what? Money is, number one, an abstract unit of account. Okay, it's not something physical. The financial system is what? Is denominating debts and credits in terms of that unit of account. Those debts and credits are held on some balance sheet someplace by a wholesaler, by a banker, by some institution that matches debits and credits, so that the payments in the system is not by passing physical coins from one individual to another. It's by a bookkeeper making bank money entries on the accounts, the balance sheet bookkeeping accounts of the clients in the system. Now, if this is the case, then what does it mean? Well, it means the first thing that is most important, and going back to Keynes' determination of prices, if we look at the level of activity, okay, the level of activity is, number one, not automatically determined at full employment. Keynes has the possibility of arguing that it's the expenditure decisions, and those expenditure decisions are not constrained. Okay, there is no balance sheet constraint for the system. The balance sheet constraint is what? The balance sheet constraint is the amount of existing commodity money. Keynes says no. The ability to make payments, the ability to make investments is determined, as Schumpeter told us, by the A4 of capitalism, by the bankers, by the ability of the bankers to create credit. Credit is always domestic and endogenous to the system, so that it is impossible to say that saving determines investment. And this is the important part of the theory. It says that there is no external constraint. And if you want to finance your expansion, or you want to finance development, the financing of the development is not constrained by the physical amount of money, by the amount of gold in the system. It's constrained by the ability to create a financial system which allows you to create the financing that is required. Okay, so the bottom line of the Keynesian alternative, and the Keynesian alternative, when you look at the problems of development finance, is that development is not a question of dollar dominance. It's a question of dominance by US financial institutions. If a country wants to develop, a country develops by doing what? By developing a domestic financial institution. Okay, we have theories, development theories of center and periphery. Those center and periphery problems are in terms of physical commodities. We well know the Prebisch argument about terms of trade. Okay, those are physical constraint arguments. It's a physical production constraint of being primary commodity dependent. But developing countries are at the same time financial institution dependent. That is, they depend on developed country financial institutions in order to finance their development. And the key to development theory and the key to independent development is in terms of recognizing that developing countries are financially constrained because of the center periphery dominance of center financial institutions. Okay, basically that's what we wanted to, the point that we wanted to make about these two alternatives. And the thing to keep in mind is that this alternative theory is not something that Keynes just developed out of as a what should I say? He woke up as in a dream and developed this. This is something that, as you've seen, I can provide you 100 different references of monetary and banking theorists who make exactly the same point. And that same point is that this is not a question of misplaced concreteness. All of these theories are developed by what? Are developed by economists who actively participated in financial markets and understood how money and finance were developed, rather than these apocryphal stories about peoples in a rude state of society having to bargain apples against bananas in order to provide the division of labor. Okay, now we can stop there. And where's Jassim? We can, I think, have a little bit of time left over until you get worn out to have discussion.
Yeah, so may I request those who want to raise a question, make a comment, to please raise your hands, and then we'll go first come first. Yeah, so we have David. We can start with David, and in the meantime, others can raise your hands. David, please.
Okay.
David, you can go ahead. David's audio is not working, so we'll go to we'll go to Willie then. Willie.
Good morning, Prof. Thank you for.
Hello, Willie.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you for the splendid presentation so far, and it's also an honor to be in your presence. Can you kind of elaborate on the concept that there's no point in time, say, gold as a currency was widely used as the medium of exchange? I'm still not getting that concept.
Okay,
and
effectively, the application of gold as a normal means of payment through gold coinage, we refer normally to the British system because Britain was the one of the first and only countries that went on a full gold standard. In that particular case, you have the difficulty of gold having all of these nice attributes. That is, it's malleable, it's durable, and all of this. The problem is that it has a very high value to weight. So that in general, a very small gold coin has a very large value. Now, most transactions are retail transactions. So if you think about the development of the British system, the most used coin in transactions turned out to be what? The penny. Okay. Now, if you've ever seen a British penny that circulated in the 18th or 19th century, these things are, now they're about this big around. Now they're very large. If you've ever seen a gold coins of very high value are tiny little things like this. So that just as you have this double coincidence of wants problem between physical goods, you have the same thing between different types of metal. So that in general, for almost all systems that used these metal coins, it was always the lowest value metal which was used for the majority of retail transactions. Okay. Now, in general, what happened was the gold was used for what? It was used for, if it was used for international payments or for large-scale payments. And this is very much the same thing that we see in the current system, is that if you look at the outstanding currency in circulation on any central bank's balance sheet, that is, if you look at the liability side of the balance sheet, okay, you have this thing which we call the high-powered money. Okay, high-powered money is what? It's either banknotes, currency in circulation, or the reserve deposits of the private banking system. And the reserve deposits of the private banking system, which represent the central bank deposit banking for bank deposits, turns out to be something like 8-to-1 relative to banknotes. That is, banknotes simply are not the major form of payment. So it's something that we see in general throughout the system. Put it in a simple way, gold was simply too expensive to allow poor people to use it. So they got to use copper coins.
Oh, okay. So yeah, from this, now it makes sense, because making the case back to the first use of coin, if you may, from Lydia, the electrum, which was not pure gold, which was, I think, a mixture of gold, lead, and silver.
That's
something
correct.
like
Yeah, that's right.
I'm from West Africa, and in West Africa, I think we have used other inferior form of metals, right? So from Liberia, there's something we call the kisi money, where it was more like a string of rod, and based on the length of the rod would determine what it could be used for. There's also like another kind of money that looked like a bracelet. It has different name, but the common name from where I'm from was called Nichian. Or like in other cases, it was not even metal, like the cowries, which some places they call the gambo seeds, or the cowries were used as medium of exchange. Thanks for the clarity. I appreciate it.
Yeah. No, this is a very important, well, interesting and important point. If you read Brodel, he places great emphasis on the fact that most of the Portuguese, the beginning of Portuguese trade was in fact trades that went not to what became Brazil or everything else. This was trades through Northern Africa in order to access gold, African gold. And this was the development of Portuguese trade, in particular the slave trade that went on through the Portuguese. And that was, in fact, because of the very large gold supplies that were available in Africa, which is something which most, I mean, if you don't read Brodel, you don't recognize that you had this very elaborate production system in Africa, which was in fact why the Portuguese were interested in those trade routes.
Thank you. Can we have Fidelis next, please?
Hello. Hello,
Please.
Prof.
We can hear you, please.
Okay. Prof, I want a clarification on the barter system or the barter economy. Well, did I hear you say that there was no economy that truly solely relied on barter system, and therefore they need to introduce what is called money? Was one of the concreteness that you mentioned. Did I hear that? Or I want a clarity on that.
Okay. The real difficulty here is to define a difference between barter and physical exchange. Okay. Now, the story which is normally told when we talk about the double coincidence of wants is told in precisely this way. That is, individuals have a single commodity and they have to go out and bilaterally bargain with everything which they need for their subsistence, okay, in exchange for the commodity that they produce. Now, this is something which we have no historical evidence whatsoever that existed, okay, that particular form. On the other hand, and again, I refer back to Brodel, and not only to Brodel. If you look, there are a number of economic historians who make the case of the simultaneous existence of exchange in kind and the use of abstract units of account. Okay. Now, there, what we have is an explanation of individuals, for example, who are planters, agricultural producers, who produce their own subsistence. And if they produce an excess over their subsistence, that excess may be exchanged in the market. Okay, and that may be, in some cases, exchanged in the market for debits and credits, okay, held on balance sheets. Okay, for example, Brodel gives an example of 19th century Naples, in which you have the coexistence of physical exchange, that is, people exchange physical commodities with each other, without counterparts. Okay, and those counterparts are what? Those counterparts are notional debits and credits. So that if you have two individuals trading with each other, okay, A may give oranges to B, B may give bananas to A, okay, without any actual exchange taking place until a settlement period, that is after a month or a year or whatever, they may get together and they'll say, well, notionally, I gave you so many apples, or I gave you so many bananas, you gave me so many oranges. Now what we're going to do is settle the accounts. Is there a difference in the values? The values that are used are values of the exchange of goods in the markets. Okay, so basically what you have is a much more, what should I say, complicated explanation of the way physical exchange and monetary exchange interacted in most economic historians' explanation of the way the systems evolved. Now, if you think about this, this makes sense, okay? Because the urban centers developed differently from the rural centers. But you do have interrelationships between the rural producers and the urban centers. And the question is, how did that take place? And this is basically the kind of explanation that we're given. So the point that we're making here is that this classical story that we tell about individuals face, and the problem is that in order to generate this problem of the double coincidence of wants, you have to tell a story about an individual taking his, whatever his crop happens to be, or whatever he happens to produce, his boots, and going around one by one with all the other producers in order to engage in a relation of barter. Okay, and that's why I make this distinction between barter exchange and physical exchange. You can have physical exchange, which is done with an abstract unit of account, settling the differences between the two individuals doing the exchange.
Thank you. Can we have David now? I don't know. David, does your microphone work? Shall we try? We don't hear you, David. No, why don't you log off and log in? Meanwhile, Ritvik, can you please come in?
So, really lovely lecture. One comment and one question. So, I really enjoyed your lecture primarily because the first time I came across this idea that, well, most economics textbooks lie to us about this evolution of money. I came across it in this book by David Graeber called Debt. And I think one very interesting thing that he talks about is that any evidence of barter, any story about barter, any real thing that happened with regard to barter always happened in societies or in circumstances where money existed, or there actually was like some kind of system of exchange, be it money, be it some other kind, and that no longer existed. So, for example, in the 5th century, trade in Western Europe was happening in Imperial Roman gold coins. The unit of exchange was Imperial Roman gold coins, which stopped existing 100 years before that, right? So that was like a really sort of, I really enjoyed a very solid expansion of that in your lecture today. On the question, and this is a very weird one. So Keynes, and Keynes, obviously, you mentioned his importance in this idea of talking about money. Now, Keynes is also sort of a progenitor or one of the key designers of the Bretton Woods system. And the imagination of a large clearinghouse like the IMF, etc., coming from concerns of balance and payments crises and stuff like that. So having this sort of, again, talking about exchange, and the system itself functioned on a lot of IOUs and stuff across countries to settle exports and imports. Now, how does this square with this notion that also got peddled around, that the dollar is as good as gold, and to actually fix an exchange value of the dollar with gold, right? That just seems a bit contradictory even for Keynes. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he didn't come up with that idea. But I was just a bit confused as to how those square together. Thank you.
Okay, in the third lecture, we'll get to the clearinghouse, because I think you've identified precisely where that clearinghouse proposal came from. That is, it was a more or less direct development of the work that Keynes had already done on domestic monetary systems. And in fact, he tells us in the clearinghouse proposal, he says this is nothing different than what happens in a national financial system. All we're doing is now elevate, if you like, elevating the clearinghouse from the domestic banks to an international institution. So that in that regard, what we have is that Bretton Woods was not a clearinghouse. Okay, Bretton Woods was, in fact, as Keynes remarked, there's a very famous quotation in which, if I remember, it was the meeting in Savannah, he makes something to the remark. He says, well, this is very interesting because what we have here is a bank, which is a fund, and a fund, which is in fact a bank. And his argument was that the IMF was in fact a bank. That is, it was lending money against bank reserves. Now, that is basically the kind of financial institution that works on the basis of a quantity theory of money. It's not simply a clearinghouse in which you match debits and credits. So that the IMF, although Keynes was willing to support eventually the creation of the IMF, he was not willing to support the use of the dollar as the unit of account at the same time as gold. And the historical evidence of this is that if you read the memoirs of Robertson and James Mead, in fact, the decision to allow gold and the dollar to exist as the basic unit of the IMF was a decision that was taken by Dennis Robertson in the commission the night before the final agreement was presented, without Keynes' knowledge. So he had no idea that this was going to happen. So for him, it was taken as, if you like, it was a fait accompli. Robertson had agreed to it, and it was written up into the final proposal. And Keynes apparently got up the next morning, saw the final proposal, and was faced with a choice of either voting against it or accepting it. And in the end, he accepted it rather than objecting. So you're absolutely right in identifying both the similarity between his clearinghouse and what he did at the level of the national economy, and the difference between that and what the IMF eventually does. And this is what, in fact, causes this problem of the dollar as the dominant currency. Had that not happened, we would never have had this dollar problem.
Thank you. Can we have David again? Can we try with David?
Okay, David is still there trying.
He's come back, so let's see. David, no, I'm sorry. Huh? We are. Let's
Well,
go
can
with.
can he try and write out his?
Yes. David, put in your comment question in the chat box, please. Ivan?
Hello, yes. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Dr. Kregel. So actually, I just had some, like really, I guess just a simple question. So actually, background, I have studied at UMKC, graduate and undergraduate level. So I'm kind of familiar with your work from there, although it's very dense. But I guess just getting more into Keynes and the clearinghouse, like where is there really like an accessible source where he like sort of explicitly discusses it all together, or is it really just kind of here and there, or like meeting minutes and stuff like that?
Well, we do have most of the drafts, and we do have most of the correspondence around the clearinghouse. Now, the basic, linkage that links up the ancient money, the treatise, the general theory, and the clearinghouse comes in terms of this very direct reference to what he calls the banking principle in the clearing proposals. Now, that banking principle is what? He tells us very clearly this is what he mentioned, what he talks about in the treatise as bank money. And if you remember the passage which I read, is that in the treatise, he goes through this argument. He says, okay, we have the unit of account, okay, and we have money proper. Okay, money proper is what allows us to discharge a debt denominated in unit of account. But then he goes on and he says, but we note that there's this thing called bank money. Bank money is what? Bank money is simply the bankers doing entries, double credited, double entry bookkeeping. And then he goes on and said, well, in most cases, that bank money, okay, serves effectively the purpose of money proper. So that what you have is more or less an identity between the unit of account and the instrument which discharges a debt in unit of account. Okay? Now, this is important or critical or, what should I say, relevant. Why? Because if you look, say, for example, you look at the work of Minsky, okay? Minsky makes the point, he says, look, why do people hold deposits with banks? Do they hold deposits with banks because of the traditional explanation, because bankers are smarter than they are and they know how to invest their money? Minsky says, no, bankers are not always smarter. In fact, in general, our experience is that bankers are not that smart because they always manage to go bankrupt. People hold those deposits. Why? Because those deposits represent credits which can be used to extinguish debts that they have with the banking system. And this is exactly the same argument that Keynes is making. He's saying, okay, that bank money, okay, is useful. Why? The bank money is useful because the bank money allows us to discharge a debt in unit of account. So the unit of account is what? Unit of account is the dollar. Okay, the bank money is the deposit. The deposit is now denominated in dollars or whatever your national currency happens to be. And if you have a debt in that unit of account, you can use the credit with the bank to extinguish that debt. You don't need a quote unquote money proper. You don't need a piece of gold. You don't need any physical commodity. All you need is a credit inside the system. And that's why you're willing to hold that system. Now, I would argue that there's an even more important point. And the more important point is that if you look at production, production requires the acquisition of inputs before the sale of outputs. Okay, so that any producer, when he's producing, right, has to create debits. It creates those debits where? Well, you can either create the debit relative to your labor force. Okay, you say to your workers, okay, guys, I'm going to pay you in a month, or I'm going to pay you in 6 months. So you have a debit that workers are holding as credits, and eventually you have to match those. And the way do you match them? Well, the producer matches them if he manages to sell something to the worker, and the worker says, okay, I'm going to give you your credit back. And that's how the system works. Or you can say you work it through a clearinghouse, and that clearinghouse is the bank. So the banker, okay, takes the debit of the producer. It gives them the banker's credit. The banker transfers that credit to the workers. The workers then take that credit and give it back to the bank. And then when the worker buys the output of the producer, that credit gets transferred back to the producer. The producer gives it back to the banks, and it cancels out. Okay, so this is the kind of system that we're thinking about. So that in this particular case, you're always willing to hold a debit or a credit in the system because, as Kane says, you're all part of that system. Now, if you take that up to the clearinghouse level, exactly the same thing happens. That is, as long as everybody is in the clearinghouse, as long as everybody participates, everybody should be willing to hold a credit. And at that level, that credit is what? Basically, it's a current account surplus that you have. You're willing, okay, to take a credit on that current account surplus relative to a country that's in debit, because it always gives you the possibility to use that credit in order to extinguish a debit inside the system.
Okay. One more question, if I may.
Yep. Sure.
So you mentioned Minsky. I've actually read a few books by Minsky, including his book on Keynes. And I remember in it, he's basically talking about how Keynes basically has two different monetary theories in the treatise on money. Like like you were saying, the set of assumptions that he grew up with, and then over the course of the work, he sort of is building something better, something more. Is there any sort of like post Keynesian like commentary or selections from where I could get like, well, where one could read and just get like the latter theory sort of with all the quantity stuff sort of selected out of the treatise on money, because it's like a 2-volume book. I imagine just one volume isn't particularly easy to read. Seems kind of, you see what I'm saying?
Yep. I don't know. I've written a number of pieces on this. Some of them are on my website. You can look on them, and if you send me a note, I can always try and send you some stuff.
Okay. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you. David has his question in the chat box, but Juliana has also been waiting for a while. So, Prof, if you could look at David's question,
okay,
and then we'll have Juliana after that.
Okay, we're waiting for Juliana, or are we going to do David first?
We'll do David first, yeah.
Okay, we can do, let's do David first, because I've now done that. Okay. Now, in terms of the fundamental equations of the treatise, rather than saying that these are full employment, Keynes calls them equilibrium positions. And the argument of volume 2 of the treatise is to show how the system, through what Keynes calls his short period theory of money, how the system returns to those equilibrium positions. And this is the problem that he talks about in the preface to the general theory, in which he says, well, basically, the problem was that I never allowed the system to move away from that equilibrium. Okay, so if you take the standard fundamental equations for the prices of available output in the treatise, like I said, you've got this, basically you have two arguments in the equation. The first is efficiency wages, and the second is the difference between savings and investment. So if you take his explanation of a condition in which you have excess supplies, the excess supplies occur why? Well, the excess supplies are occurring because savings are exceeding the investments. Okay, so it means that the amount of output in the available output sector is greater than the income which is being spent, so that there are losses being created on that sector, and those losses correspond to excess output. Now, what happens then is what? Well, what happens is that according to traditional theory, prices are supposed to fall. But Keynes makes the argument, he says, look, if prices are falling, it becomes rational for individuals to wait for prices to fall further. Okay, why should you go ahead and produce now if you expect prices to fall? He then goes a step even further and he says, well, it may be the case, if you have the expectation that prices are going to fall, that you sell short. That is, you sell output that you don't have. And in volume 2, he talks about the theory of forward market. So he said you enter into a forward contract in which you offer to sell stuff that you don't have, because you expect to be able to buy it back at a cheaper price in the future. Now, what does this do? It says that normally, okay, the theory of static theory of supply and demand says that if price is below equilibrium, supply is going to contract and demand is going to increase. But in this particular case, what happens is that supply increases and demand falls. You get just the opposite of what the static theory shows. So he then says, what's going to happen? Well, he said, in the end, something's going to happen, is that you're going to run to these excess supplies are going to run out. The government may come in and decide to set up a buffer stock. Something might happen. And eventually you're going to get to a position that people are going to expect prices in the future to be higher than they are today. And if that's the case, then people are going to start buying up the excess stocks. And if they start buying up the excess stocks, then what's going to happen is that people might decide to produce now, rather than simply buying up the excess stocks. And as a result, the system does what? Well, instead of expanding, it just goes back to the equilibrium, or that's what his argument is. So he says there, I missed the point. The point should have been that these adjustments change the equilibrium position. That is, output should go up or output should go down. But it doesn't. It just goes back to that equilibrium. So in response to your question, it's not that it's a full employment situation, it's an equilibrium. And it may be or it may not be full employment. Okay, at that stage, really, people had no conceptual idea of what full employment was going to mean. So again, Phillips curve relation at this point, the presumption is that there is no impact on wages, so efficiency wages stay the same. So again, you can't have a Phillips curve unless you have some sort of change in output. If you look at the Koleski problem, the inflation problem, well, this is what John Robinson calls the inflation barrier, okay? And the point is that the Koleski problem here, Koleski had a very traditional approach to financing. What Keynes would have argued is that as long as individuals are able to match debits and credits, and individuals are able to access the outputs that are, sorry, the inputs that they need to produce, then the system should be only producing up to potential output, okay? For example, if you're going to have excess supply because of excess production, it means that somebody has to be able to buy the inputs for that excess output. Okay, and if all of these things are bilateral transactions, now, unless somebody is willing to sell you something that he hasn't got, then you're not going to have inflation. But this would be speculative inflation, not excess demand inflation. Okay, Juliana, we're ready now for you.
Hi, Professor Kregel. Thanks for the lecture. I think I have mostly two questions. One would be in terms of the concept that you've used of misplaced concreteness. Does it kind of also incorporate this notion of a process that kind of misplaces the causes with consequences? So in a sense that takes, for example, exposed results and puts it as it was ex ante condition, for example. So because I do know that most of a heterodox approach kind of reclaims this historical part of money to show that this Robinson Crusoe history was never there pretty much in the history of humanity, but it feels like it's a little bit incomplete to just make this claim, because modern institutions, especially in capitalism, they are constantly finding new ways to kind of atomize individuals and put them in a condition that makes this story minimally rational, or it makes the story sound like it's feasible to think of history in such terms. So does this my question would be if misplaced concreteness is also this misplacement of causes and consequence, for example. And my second question would be more I'm trying to kind of emphasize some of the points you've mentioned when you were talking about, for example, MFI, because you talked about intermediaries, and you also talked about institutions in the very end, with a very interesting conclusion on that. So I was wondering if you're using like financial institutions or institutions as a synonym for intermediaries, or you were thinking more in a sense that there is a qualitative change once you reach the role of intermediaries, especially with respect to their relation with money. Yeah.
Okay. In relation to the first one, there's a interesting paper by James Tobin, which is called Ex Post Ergo Propter Hoc, which deals with that particular problem. I think you've hit precisely that difficulty, and this is sort of what I was attempting to suggest by the idea of historical selection bias. Okay, this idea, and you find it, well, the thing which always struck me, there's a passage at the beginning of one of Jean-Baptiste Say's books, where he says, I get up every morning and I look out over Paris. And obviously, so he lived in Montmartre or something like that. I don't know. But he says, I look out over Paris and I note that all of these people are out there and they're all doing their own thing. But every morning I get the milk on my doorstep. I get the bread for my breakfast. I get everything which I need. So obviously, there must be something which allows this to happen. Now, what is it that allows it to happen? And he sort of works backwards and he says, okay, it's the market process that does this. And this then becomes the precise example of what I think what you're talking about. So he's saying, because this has happened, it must be the case that that's the way it came through. And if you look at Mises' argument, in the end, which I sort of, we skipped over rather rapidly because we were running out of time. But this is basically Mises' argument as well. He said, well, we don't need anything else except to know that this happened. And if we know that this happened, all that's required is a solution, an explanation. Now, we know that there was nobody who planned it, or at least we presume that we know that. And as long as we take that assumption, then it must have been this spontaneous action of the market which produced that result. And he said, that's all we need. I don't care if historically it happened or it didn't happen, okay? All I need is what in the Austrian tradition they call the praxology. And as he says, as long as we have praxology, that's good enough for me. And that's the way I'm going to proceed. And that's sort of the error that we're trying to identify, because the error is not so much to say that's good enough for me, it's that you then use that in order to say this is what should happen. Okay, and this is what they do. They argue against any other form of economic organization as being a possible solution to this. Okay, and this is this was back in the time period when, as a result of the First World War, there was, and this is before the advent of very detailed econometric planning, but that some sort of government planning and government control was a very sensible way to operate the economy. And this was true in most of the economies in which they had some sort of war production office or war production bureau or something like that. And this is basically the explanation that we use for that. Okay, that's the first part. The second question, remind me again what the second question was.
It would be just a clarification, because you talked about intermediaries, but also in the end you concluded with the idea of institutions. Yeah,
no, the point is that once you look at the way in which this whole, the whole range of economic, well, we don't want to say economic history, but economic theorists who have dealt with the problem, all of them end up with some form of intermediation. Now, in modern times, Bob Clower and Meyer Burstein were the ones who were most interested, most concerned about this. And if you think about the entire French school, Jean-Pascal Bénécy and these people, they all picked up on that particular strand. Now, the only point that I was attempting to make is that there are all sorts of these alternative ways in which you can solve the problem. So that the one, well, the sort of the provocative one is to say, okay, take Voras. All Voras was doing was representing what bankers do. Okay, he did it in a different institutional form. Okay, the auctioneer does what? Well, think of the auctioneer as not matching debits and credits, but as the auctioneer of sitting there with client balance sheets and then adding debits and credits in terms of the bids and offers that come forward. And he doesn't close his books until what happens? Well, until they all balance. Okay, and that's a Walrasian equilibrium. So you can say, okay, Walras, most alternative theorists think that Walras is silly because, well, that's not the way production takes place. But yes, in the abstract, it is. If you think of it that way, in terms of balance sheets, in terms of matching debits and credits, that's all that the tâtonnement does. And in fact, if you read Walras, he was talking about, as we know, he was talking about the French financial markets and the trading of rents in the thing. And in fact, realistically, it was a more or less correct description of what happened on the Paris market. That is, you did have the possibility of going back and recontracting. So that if you're familiar with Edgeworth's argument about recontracting, this was a solution which, in fact, did exist in the determination of equilibrium prices in the Paris market. Now, the criticism that you might make about this is that if you look at that process was valid. Why? Because once all these agents de bourse came into the Recent, came into the ring and had their carnets with all of the client orders, the building was closed. Okay? None of the clients could anticipate or could communicate orders to their agents. So that all of the agents were doing was calculating a set of equilibrium prices on a given set of information. Okay, so people couldn't change their mind. They couldn't see if the price was going up or going down, saying, "Oh, I would like to buy more. I want to buy less." Okay, what was written down in the book was written down in the book, and the agent couldn't move from there. Okay, so that's the criticism you want to make. You don't say it was not realistic. You can say that it wasn't realistic in terms of a description of the way the process went on. It was unrealistic for what? Unrealistic for a production economy. And this is why Keynes said, when he said, one of the main points which I had in the general theory was that anticipations of the future have an impact on present prices. Walras, that can't happen. Okay, because all of those things are already contained in the information which comes to the market.
Thank you, Prof. Maybe we could stop for the day on that note. We have 2 more lectures, one day after, and that's Wednesday, and one Thursday. Yeah, so on that note, I would like to thank you very much for today's lecture. You held us on for this long. It was very interesting. We look forward to the next 2 lectures. Would you like to share your lecture slides now, meaning after this lecture, or will you do it after all the 3 are done?
I can send them to you right away after we finish. Sure.
Yes, please. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Good evening, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.